Grief is interesting, and the way that we end up honoring the dead ends up being a very interesting thing. Um, I don't think we ever stop honoring the dead, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with the movie Coco, but in the movie Coco, um, this is a movie that um, basically most of it takes place in sort of the afterlife, right? And you find out that the dead have relationships and they have ongoing dramas beyond their living time. And one of the things that I always think about is there's a character, a minor character in the movie, that what happens is that the minute people stop bringing flowers to the dead, basically that person just gets forgotten even in the land of the dead. And so I think about that a lot, right? Every day, every year, every month, every so often, who are we remembering that shouldn't be forgotten? This next poem is called Marero. And Marero, for those of you who don't know, it's a term for MS-13, a member of MS-13 slash a gang member from primarily from the northern triangle of Central America. So we're talking about El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And this is Marero. I learned to cleave through the whirlwinds on his back, unclaimed lacerations, bullet holes gaping on forsaken walls, mercy tattoos. He blew ships of crystal meth in my ear, the sea a nightmare in gunmetal gown. He said, "My ass so tight, baby." A murmur of splinters half birth on bruised muscle. On his shaved head, black horses in a long funeral procession of ashes. And from his shoulders, names in calligraphy of the missing. The dead shoveling their pulperias from the ground where their sons and daughters still dream of having mouths. I hung my coniferous body from his nipple rings, ducking the coral snake coiling down his gravel chest. A girl with the tail of a dragon sucking on a headless girl on his bicep, mouthing "Corre, cabrón." A prisoner like me to a body our mothers to a body our mothers have placed inside garbage bags. Old jokes, the dirt under his nails, fertile. On his thighs, yucca petals. In his shade, a communion of spare sweat. If I licked the word sur on his neck, I found the ala. If I licked norte on the scruff of his neck, a juncture where feathers became carnations. Again and again, he pressed his lit cigarette on my knees and asked to guess where his first scar would emerge. How the headmasters teach us brown boys to shed our inheritance, drink from the current wine. Once, while the rosary beads about my neck ripened like lesions, he ripped my tongue, spat out a lizard. That night I bled in his hands, and from his hands a seagull cawed at the wrong bestial father. Armpit, torn banner. Love, desert gnats. Whenever I've spilled deliverance down the shallow throats of unbelievers, I've meant for lust to be drunk, for thumbs to frame new eyes. The wood storks return to their swamps, and our groins praise all that's been banished. So I guess I'm gonna read one more poem, and then we can get into the Q&A. And then, if people feel too shy, I can read one more poem. But I'd like to close with this poem. It's a poem that is a part of the series called Queer Dactyl in the book. And this series, there's 13 poems in the book. It sort of erupts, it goes in and out throughout the book. What you need to know is that there's more than one queer dactyl. And the other thing is there's a mother called Mother Dactyl. She goes by different names. And then there's an asteroid that wants to basically destroy this party going on. This one is page 8. Thank you so much for asking me. This one is page 8. And the asteroid sometimes goes by the name of Dude Steroid, and all kinds of weird names. But yeah, let's see. Have I sweated too much? No. Queer Dactyl. You don't have to watch me with my wings back and forth to count the number of fires I put out. Single-handedly, lady, don't play. Up and out, don't break your nails on that tricera thought. Out and up, work that bill, work that bill, work that bill. Dude Steroid wanted to barge in here, old Dude Steroid splainy, old PC blazing, but I was like, nope. You can't be going around preaching that embers wash off more easily than glitter. Not if you're going to fry our camouflage nightgowns with your silicate dick complex, exploding on every beach we go sunbathing on like a bottle of Viagra roulette. They used to call me Shorty for my short appendages, but I ain't no chicken head, no duck head. Don't confuse my bobbing for my elongated lips for submission, for a trick daddy's mass extinction. Lift that tail, swing that pitchfork, swing that tail, tail drop. Mama Dactyl used to say that when you deal with murderous jaws larger than yours, you ought to multiply your fortunes near an active volcano. Sniff the fumes, swallow your enemy's offspring in one gulp, go for the long necks first. Bigotry will claim innocence even while it burns our sanctuaries. Raptor hole, Tirana hole, you ain't fly like me hole. To hell with Dude Steroids doing Triassic for pay. The voyeur will always miss the freedom of a red sunset. Box dip, hairpin, mating squawk, schwam, cunty, 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 cunty. Don't let them know where you hide the rest of your fangs, sis. Or that you're into fossil-friendly excavation sites that can fit entire rainbows. So what if I have pycno fibers on my back? Call me cub, call me bear, but I ain't roaring like a dino Katy Perry. Bring it. I said, bring it. Now, sachet. Dude Roy still hovering in the sky, closet queen, angel dust in this bowl of fire. Hate can't enter our ozone. And for as long as the earth remains a hungry bay, there will be no death drive. We won't perish. Our scaly spirits can survive in fields of magma. Don't they know? Silly hoes. Hoes that can't even get into this party. Hoes. No one's ditching this bitch without leaving an impression. Phoenixes on the dance floor, thrusting in the face of loss. Thank you. All right.
Roy, that was absolutely on fire. Thank you. I'm not sure if you could see people snapping or what your screen settings are, but that was really electrifying.
Thank you.
Yeah, I see people saying they have chills in the chat. Amazing, amazing. Thank you. So let's maybe launch this conversation, and maybe people might ask you to have requests to read certain things that they love from the book, and maybe we can sprinkle that throughout. But I want to ask you to start about the queer dactyls, and I just really adore them in the book, and they're amazing. There's nothing like them in contemporary poetry, and I want to ask you about your relationship to form, because the queer dactyl strikes as its own creature, its own form in some way, and you have great muscle and elasticity when you play with form in the book, established forms as well as invented. You know, I see the centosistinas and these forms that you're working within, but kind of creating your own stamp on. But the queer dactyl feels kind of like its own thing. And so I would love to hear how this form came into being for you, if you see it as a form, and also because I have my queer poetics students here, I wanted to ask um, what your notion is of whether one can queer form at all. Is that something that feels possible to you? And what does that mean for you?
Thank you so much for that. Oh my God, those are two really just heavy questions. I'm like catching my breath. One of the things that I, especially with that particular poem I just read, I don't know if some people have, if everyone has access to it or not, or even if you can see it. Yes,
Mhm.
but basically the form is very simple. It's made up of couplets, right? Two-line stanzas, and one of the things that I had to contend with, especially, with how I'm delivering the poem, this is the kind of poem that wants to explode, right? It says exploding on every beach we go sunbathing on. Like it wants to explode across the page.
Yeah.
And to me, I have to think about that because I'm like, okay, right? Like form should come out of the content that I'm creating here. But I was thinking a lot about the idea of cross dressing. And I
Mm.
was also thinking about the idea of like what happens when you, at least visually, give the reader this weird expectation that they're about to read something so stately that in
Mhm.
fact is throbbing, right? It's constantly moving in different directions.
Mhm.
So that to me was very important in thinking about the queer dactyl poems. That how do you, how are you able to capture so much gas in a jar? Yeah, right. Like,
Mhm.
how are you able to capture something that again, it looks to the reader like just some regular old poem, when in fact it's doing a lot, right? It's doing what I think it's cross dressing, and so cross dressing is something that comes up in my work, um, because to me it's important, right? To think about cross dressing as one form of thinking about gender, right? And disrupting gender binary. So that's one way that I can answer that question. Another thing is that I love I for me the expression queering form is so it's important. And I think that queering form can happen even when the form is already something like the sonnet, right? Something that we've inherited that has such a particular kind of contract with the reader, and that instead it's vacillating and doing, strange, new things. And so that's how I think about that. There are other poems in the book that, as you said, there's like the cento stuff, like there's the part in, there's one of the poems here, the In Service of Silence, where I create a cento from two albums by Sinead O'Connor. And, there's also what happens in the one section called Self Portrait According to George W. Bush, which is in that section, there's also mistranslation. There's like intentional mistranslation, right? And the whole point of it is, what happens when, again, you see something or you are told that you should quote unquote accept this, but it ends up being something else.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the idea of furtiveness, the
Mm-hmm.
idea of, thinking about Fred Moten's the idea of undercommons, right? Like, how do we destabilize power
Mm-hmm.
from within the core? It's really important, right? Especially in the undercommons, he's talking about the academy, but I've always thought about it in terms of even language.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite and most essential writers is Franz Kafka. And
Mm-hmm.
what I find so peculiar again about Kafka is that he contaminated and did these incredible things to the German language. It wouldn't have happened if if he hadn't brought his own identities, right, to the
Mm-hmm.
table. And so I love that idea that something looks like one thing, and yet there is this sense of the uncanny, right? There's this sense that you have to almost take a double look, because you're, yeah, like you've been either tricked or you've been triggered by something that happened in the past. um I love those kinds of things.
That's so wonderful. I love this idea of sort of detonating from within to use the expected structure, right? The couplets of this queer dactyl that we just heard, but then to really, as you say, play and also contaminate language, right? And partially, I think that comes from the hybridity and the plurality of the scope of what you include in there,
Mhm.
and just these delicious references to pop culture and the Spanglish and the multiplicity and the plurality. There's more in there than you expect to find when you look at the page, and that's
Yeah, and for me, like as you said, it's like the contamination is also of like what we typically call like high art, and low art. I'm thinking about this particular last poem where I'm talking about the death drive, such a pregnant concept, while at the same time I can think about Viagra and
Mhm,
then roulette, right? Viagra roulette. Like I want people to feel a sense of defamiliarization when they come across this work because, for people who've experienced a form of diaspora, a form of discrimination, oppression, the world is in black and white,
mhm,
right? There's always these gray areas of potential.
mhm, mhm. I see that there's maybe a question here. Julia has a question. Julia Leverone, excellent. So let's open this up. To continue off some of what both Nomi and Roy have said, what is your relationship to English, Roy, as your performing witness?
Yeah, beautiful, Julia. Thank you so much. I am someone that, so I'm a poet who, of course, understands the imperialistic history of English. But for me to call that out, I must also call out the imperialistic history of Spanish. And so I'm essentially navigating two imperialistic languages. And so, as I was talking about Kafka, for me, it's also, again, very important. Like, how are we through neologisms, right? Like that you might find throughout the book, where I create these like verbs that don't exactly exist, these words that don't exactly exist. Like there's the quinceañera poem where I take the notion of remorse and I call it a remorse, which to me, what I'm trying to do is again think about not just the expectations of articles, right, in grammar, but I'm also thinking about the ways in which language is elastic, right? And because it's elastic, that it is disingenuous for me to stick to a very rigorous form of, grammar. And
Mhm.
so in syntax, for instance, like in English, I do that. Sometimes like
Mhm.
I wait until you know what exactly is happening in a sentence, which I think for those of you who speak German, that also ends up being something that you find in Kafka, right? That I want to lead you down this labyrinth, and then once you get to the center, allow you to realize something that you didn't expect, right?
Mhm.
Um, so that I feel is my relationship to English.
And you have there's such elasticity of language in this book, I find, and also of grammar and syntax, which is something that absolutely delights me. Really long, winding syntax and right, these kind of composite verbs, these kind of invented verbs, and also the way in which I think sometimes one feels in these poems as if one is starting in the middle of an argument. Um,
Yeah,
which it was so interesting to me syntactically and as a way to inhabit language and also time insofar as I remember there were a couple kind of in medias res where you begin with something like as if or on the
yeah,
contrary, um, and I'm really interested in how that relates to this elasticity of language but also how you negotiate being within time.
yeah. That to me is very important. The notion of the moment,
Hmm.
right? And this is something that I have learned even through short story writing, right? That the short story for me, I think about it in almost similar ways, where you have this story, larger story, right? But where in that story are you going to then focus, right? It's almost like this, like, thinking about the sort of the Batman, like the
Hmm.
light in the sky, trying to find something, and here we are. And for me, I think about that a lot with these sort of instances of like on the contrary, as you pointed out, it is not a fallacy, neither gag, the other with quinceañera after they dropped. I want you to understand that the book isn't isn't there to accommodate around you,
Mm.
that is asking the reader to almost accommodate it, themselves around the geometry of the book, which can be incredibly uncomfortable. And
Hmm.
I think for me, as I know for other people who write about like, war, death, violence, um, it's not easy to write in the first place. So
Hmm.
why, if it's not easy for me to necessarily write, why do I need to offer you this sort of, Thomas Kincaid, this peachy portrait of the world, when in fact that's not the case for many of us? And so, yeah, I think about that as you were pointing out, Nomi.
This is so beautiful, the idea of accommodating around the geometry of the book, because I think about the way in which one has to accommodate around the geometries of all sorts of structures, being a human and being a vulnerable human. And in this book in particular, we travel through colonialism and immigration and racism and homophobia and xenophobia and all these, in some sense, structures are their own geometries that we have to navigate. Um, and
Power doesn't ask us,
yeah,
about its nature.
yeah.
Instead, it pushes us to accommodate ourselves around it. And
Hmm.
so we need to do the same thing with power. And there's two things that there's two words of feedback that I've received from different writers that make me think about this idea of the geometry slash accommodating yourself around what's happening in the book. One person, with especially with finding logic in a crushed head, someone called the work that's happening four dimensional and
Mm,
provided provided justification for that.
mhm,
And then another person read the work and called it holographic.
mm.
So again, even the idea of holograms, right?
Yeah.
That to me is so incredible that people are are sort of gravitating to those ideas, because that to me, um, as a visual writer, very visual writer, I want readers to be cute to that.
Mm. Thank you, Roy. We have the chat is now teeming with questions. So let me see. Um, let's start with this first one that comes on, which maybe is kind of a background question, but can you tell us a little bit about your journey of becoming a poet, um, and how it began and how it impacted your life after being published?
Yeah, this is something that I was talking to some students yesterday, which is that my journey as a poet zigzagged a lot. It was nothing linear at all.
Mhm,
In fact, I never foresaw myself as a child being a writer, and it's because the on the when I think about the culture and the literary forms that I grew up in Honduras, a lot of it was oral, and
mhm,
so the oral tradition, the testimonio, right, the oral history, um, those to me were more important than the written word.
mhm,
And it wasn't until later, when I started to write and to learn English, actually, that I was presented with these challenges of, how do you think about English now that you are starting to learn a second language, And now that you're learning a second language, how does that then reflect back on your own language, right? Your quote unquote native language. And so I think for me, becoming a poet has become it basically started off with a preoccupation of language and a
mhm,
preoccupation of translation. And I
mhm,
say this because, for many of us, while translation was something that you did in the library, or in the ivory tower, for me it was out of necessity.
mhm,
I needed to learn English in order to help my parents and myself out, to function as an advocate for us. And so that I think is how I ended up, gravitating to poetry. Poetry has a way of capturing these larger questions, preoccupations in ways that feel like you can hold.
mm,
I am holding this, and somehow something about what I just wrote here can capture the complexity of something that has haunted me
mm,
for many years, but now I can see it here. So for those of you who are coders, those of you who are into coding or even into, visual arts, it does feel, there's an element of epiphany, I would say,
mhm,
to having something and holding it, and having that, look back at you either with a sense of familiarity or with a sense of complete awe, you know?
Um, some wonderful questions here. You mentioned sort of the haunting of the process too, and some of these questions are touching on it. Let's see. Carrie asks, "What is the most difficult thing you've written about, and how did you overcome the challenge in order to produce the work?"
Mm, I would say that hmm, hmm. One of the most difficult things that I've written, I think it's the opening poem of the collection.
Mm.
Um,
Could you read it for us?
oh my God, I can read it. Are we going till 5:30 or so?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Um, ooh, um, I will read it and then talk about this question. Catrachos. Time blunts the crooked, the savage pews. Once, on the sibling stumps of a beat Caribbean pine, my cousins invite me to sit. My legs fold like melted candles. If I'd worn the maracas sizzle skirt of my reveries, there'd been liturgy. Maricón, maricón, maricón. Fold your hands, boy, walk straight, never graduate your hungers. Befuddlement slots on their tongues, their eyes chapels of pebbles. We mount the esote tree. Tia Mama watchtowers from the kitchen, a large pot of soup on the stove. Pataste Rapunzel with dollars, mom's monogram early in the morning. I heed to my accuser's orders. Perch on the boulders our mothers lay their clothes to mummify. Jostle against the lengthy hammock abuelo bought en el mercado. They knot my wrists with hands that have buried only mothers. I become their hummingbird embroidery, the ground on which their marbles rattle like homemade rockets. Hopscotch squares, sunrise on the sidewalk. Another underage infantry curls over, nameless flowers ambush my scraped knees. I am the lasso of a small emptiness that once called me almighty. I am pushed into the dirt hole they dig for our G. Joes, rows of tanks, artillery. He won't do it, one cousin remarks. Another one shouts, "You're wrong." Somebody wheedles me to sit on a jagged set of stairs. For my performance, I smooth out the back pockets of my pants, my heady skirt. Any creases might behoove punishment. When I hear a gasp, another gasp. Whose girl am I? I am losing my part-time voice of a child. The rock casters disperse, shoeless, like the sounds of shacks crumpling under fathers. Flowers are plucked from the bushes strewn on my knees, etiolated honeysuckles. The youngest pulls a chunk of grass and shakes his green stained hands, unlatches blades from his fingers. I take a sniff of the carnations. I hear a chortle. This is my burial a la una mendieta. Through the window, Tia Mama scrutinizes the hubbub, storms outside in her flour caked apron, hands glistening, water drops penetrating their anticipation into the ground. She pulls me by my hair. In the house, she unfastens my belt, strikes me with it, a newborn island on my cheek, the ghost of another body, my body. For supper, she serves us bland cauliflower soup. The scalding dam overfloods my throat. I avoid the white meridian scalps. When I finish, I ask for another ladleful. This appetite is now scratching the muted aqueducts. A folklore of vomit takes residence on my tongue. As my cousins turn to me, the spoons shine on their faces in this fresh body garden. The tangerine trees release their grip on the children from unforgiving floors. The little palms barely grace the ground before they crash. And so, thank you. This idea, right? That it's like um my cousins are asking me to sit in different surfaces, and then on the one surface that they've been expecting me to do this, I roll my hands, to under my pants, which is supposed to be a thing that girls do. And suddenly that becomes a symbol of my queerness, a symbol of my vulnerability. And instead of my cousins getting punished for what's happening outside, my aunt who raised me, she ends up blaming me.
Mm.
And so, and she hits me, on the face with a belt. It was very difficult to write about this because I love my aunt. My aunt is my second mom. And to be able to, in some ways, like create a mugshot out of her in that poem was very strange. It was something that I had to think about, the pros and cons of doing something like that. I had to think about, what happens when I put an experience that for me was very traumatic
Mhm.
right at the beginning of the book, and then to call it Catrachos. Am I telling readers that that's what Catrachos are? A
Mhm.
bunch of kids that beat each other up, and that harass each other. These are all questions that I had when I was putting together the book, and so I think that but in thinking about difficulty, that's one thing that I did, and overcoming the challenge is to write it.
Mhm.
To overcome the challenge is to write it, and as I was telling students yesterday, you get to decide what leaves the kitchen and what
Mhm.
stays.
Yeah, it's to me, it's this fantastic, it's this act of vulnerability that starts the book, and I we there's a question right here that actually is about what leaves the kitchen actually, and maybe you could tell everyone a little bit more about how you make that decision. Alex says you say that some of your poems are an act of grieving. How do you decide whether or not to share something so personal with your readers? What leaves the kitchen and what doesn't?
Yeah, I think for me that's a beautiful question. Um, to me, the piece of writing that puts me in a vulnerable position must also be a piece of empowerment.
Hmm.
Self-empowerment, empowerment for my people. If it cannot do both of those things, then it's not ready to leave. Then it's something that I will keep in my computer and I'm not going to share it with other people. I was talking about this too with students yesterday, which is like when things do leave the kitchen, right?
Hmm.
You must be ready to be questioned about those things, whether they be good or bad, whatever it is. You must be ready to do that, and I think that when you surround yourself with a positive and constructive, mostly constructive group of writers, you can you have the privilege of getting that kind of feedback.
Hmm.
This is why I think, the earlier you can do it, the better. Gravitate to other writers who are kind to other people's writing and who are eager to share their own writing as well, because it shows a lot about vulnerability and also, again, braveness in that space.
That's I love that you brought up this question of community and having these interlocutors, these peers who you trust. And there's another question here. Max asks about revision, which I think is such a it's this mediation. How does the thing leave the computer? Well, through revision, through time, right? And so Max says, you mentioned earlier that an event that one of the poems you read took about 3 years to revise. I am curious, were there other poems in the book that were particularly difficult or easy to revise, and why?
Yeah. So Max, so there's different answers to your question.
Hmm.
There's the answer that relates to like if you're taking a poetry workshop. The poetry workshop gives you these deadlines, right? And you must meet these deadlines and you must do your best to at least get at something, arrive at something that might be productive for you and for the professor, whoever is giving you feedback. Um, I had the privilege to sit on some of this work much longer, and I think to me that's also very important, right? That not everything I write has to be published. There are magazines out there who I'm sure are eager to publish your work, the following week after they accept it. And
Hmm.
those magazines, were very helpful to me earlier on as I was navigating the writing and publishing process. But now that I get to have a little bit more control over my narrative, right, and the narrative of my work, um, I would say that different poems are going to take different time frames. There, I think that there's at least, or maybe at most, one poem in this book that the first time it came, it basically, I call it a gift poem, right? The first time it arrived, I had to do very little to revise it. And like I said, there are other poems that have taken me years. You know, there's other work that I have not published that it simmers. You know, every so often I come back to it, and I come back to it a new sort of writer, and I make changes to it. But then it's like, okay, let's, and back goes the manuscript into hibernation. The poem goes back into hibernation. So um, yeah, I think that that's important. I think right now it's as a writer, you also have to be very in tune with what is out there.
Mm-hmm.
That's also a thing that it's really important, because you're not writing in a vacuum, right? You're not just writing for yourself and publishing it for yourself. You're writing it to be in conversation with what's already out there, for
Mm-hmm.
better or worse. And you're going to be taken to task. You know, if you write a poem about environmental justice, you will be taken to task with other, poems about, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. The same way that if you write about particular forms of trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that your trauma is more or less valid than somebody else's trauma, but it's important to know how people write about trauma if
Mm-hmm.
you're going to write about trauma.
This is a perfect segue into a really good question that's here about kind of the politics of representation and persona in particular. And so Matt says, Roy, I was really interested in what you said about persona poems. Could you expand on your thoughts about how persona can represent these lost voices? I'm also wondering about the precarious position you mentioned that persona poems stand in. They might border on something like appropriation, which opens up another discussion about who has the right to represent which personas. How do you navigate these questions in your work, or what's your opinion on this discussion in general?
That's a great question, Matt. On the one hand, so one way to answer that question, that's a really, really rich question, is, you know, fiction writers are doing this left and right? They're already doing this left and right. Some successfully, others, in a two-dimensional way, unfortunately, or in a one-dimensional way, I should say. Um, I think one of the things that you have to be very um, so I'm gonna go back to Carolyn Forche, right? Carolyn Forche was not necessarily writing persona poems, but she was writing about poems about, for instance, the Civil War in El Salvador. And nowadays the question will be, well, what kind of right does she have to write about a trauma that is not directly affecting her, right? From which, as an American, she can quickly leave. But one of the things that you should know about someone like Carolyn Forche is, when she was writing this work back in the 70s and 80s, just recently I saw her, well, before the pandemic, I saw her when she came to the Twin Cities, Minneapolis. That woman has not given up on the fight. And to me, that's really important, that you practice what you write, and
Mhm.
that you write about your practice. Meaning that if you're gonna write about your time in Guatemala, in Mexico, in South Africa, that these poems do not just become poems about exoticizing or being a tourist in a place, but that in fact the culture, the language, the people, they make up who you are, right? That you're in constant communication with that. Because I think a lot of readers can tell when a writer is being disingenuous about their entrance into certain conversations. And I say this because, there are white people out there that, in a heartbeat, I would listen to when it comes to thinking about politics in Central America. Why? Because these people have done their homework. These people have literally been, they've spent years talking about and researching and empowering Central American writers, um, even in ways that I haven't. One of my former colleagues in the MFA program, she writes about her time in Guatemala, where she was literally helping women, indigenous women in certain villages, think about their own um, health, right? And thinking about their own, uteruses and their own vaginas and things like that. And I'm like, my ass has never done that before. I don't know that I see that as a line of possibility for me, right? And the fact that she's writing about this because she literally lived there many years and whatnot, I don't fault her, right? This is her experience, as a white woman. And at no point is she appropriating it or saying, "Oh, look at me from the Midwest, so suddenly finding out that I'm indigenous." Absolutely not, right? And so that's one way to think about this question. And then the other question is that if you're ever interested about in persona poems, there are tons of examples out there, from both, from people in different cultures, of persona poems. And like I said, the problem is not so much appropriation as it is exploitation. If you are publishing a poem about a community of people and you're benefiting from that poem, and that poem is opening doors for you, but you don't bother to name how that community allowed you to work through that poem, then you're being disingenuous. You're basically just being a capitalist. And so appropriation, I understand, is a common word in today's conversations. For me, I worry more about exploitation, right?
Thank you. I think that was a wonderful answer to
Thank
something
you.
really tricky.
Yeah.
And I love this idea of honesty, actually, and not exploiting, not turning people into a commodity in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you're writing a poem about like an Asian American's experience, first of all, ask yourself why if you're not from that community, and then ask people,
Right.
and if this doesn't mean that now you need to go outside, like with a brochure and ask any Asian American person you come across, like, hey, can you tell me if this poem is correct? Because there are issues with that too, but if you're writing a poem, a persona poem about an Asian American, I expect that you would have done the homework. And
Yeah,
the home, yeah,
also I think also the question of turning your lens on your own desire. Why?
yeah.
Why are you doing this? Why is this what is this about, right?
There are poems that are like that, where the writer literally tells you, this is what I'm about to do, and suddenly turns that lens back on themselves because it's interesting. Like, what is your motivation for going into territory that isn't something that you grew up in, It
Right.
could be like any territory.
Right. This like question of self-scrutiny is so important. Um,
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we have all these other questions. What to ask you next? It's very exciting. Um, okay, how about so this is a question. This is from Sam. Sam writes, as a gay woman who dealt with internalized homophobia and compulsive heterosexuality, from being
Yep.
raised Catholic, your references to religion really resonated with me. What impact does religion have in your writing and in your life?
Yeah. um, there's a lot that religion affects me a lot and influences me a lot. One of the privileges that I have is that I grew up with many different religions. And that to me, I think has from a very early age allow me to understand this question of right and wrong, right? That there were many versions of right and there were many versions of wrong, and there were many versions of punishment and sin and whatnot. And so I think that that is the privilege that I have as a person who grew up with that. I would say that the iconography, right, of religion is incredibly important, where and this you can see on Instagram if you follow like queer artists. the ways in which queer artists end up um, using, symbols connected to the Virgin Mary, right? The ways in which angels, for instance, end up being um, used for certain causes. To
Mhm.
me, that's all. It's rich, right? And it's basically religion is a reminder that I inherited this, and so it's up to me what I do with it.
Mhm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see what to ask you next. Here's a question about, I like this. Anne Marie, I'm taken by your attention to an observation of hands, wrists, and nails throughout your poetry. Hands are an object I'm drawn to in visual art. Is there an object that you are particularly drawn to that finds its way into your work again and again?
Anne Marie, that's such a beautiful question. And it's a very perceptive question. Actually, maybe at some point I'll write about this, but I had a little over 100 images that I had been thinking as possible covers. And I knew that I wanted hands, right? Like that's something that I knew. And I'm so lucky that hands made it to the cover of the book. Um, and the reason why I love hands is hands hands for me at least, they're invested, they're connected to labor, they're connected to care, they're
Mm,
connected to nurturing, they're connected to um, um, pleasure, they're also connected to divination,
mm,
and and yeah, so for me all of these different things were very important as I thought about this cover. um orchids make it, they appear throughout the book. Or the orchid is the sort of national flower of Honduras, and so sometimes when orchids come up I'm thinking about them in both, um, um, in different kinds of identities, right? Like what they embody. Let's see what else comes up here. There's something that okay, so this is where I guess you can tell the scholar has come in this work. There are several poems where I make references to Aristotle. I think there's about 3 poems, and I freaking hate Aristotle. Like, I love different kinds of philosophers, but I hate Aristotle. And I'm both grateful for what I've learned about Aristotle and his influence, right, on life. But I also despise Aristotle because Aristotle was he was the father of classification. And to me, classification starts getting into issues of surveillance, issues of categorization, issues of marginalization.
mhm,
And so Aristotle, when he comes up in some of these poems, is this tendency to find like this clean narrative, right? Like thinking about like the elements of plot, right? The exposition, the rising action climax, what is it? The falling action, and then the nouement or resolution, right? That's something that's Aristotle. And for me, every time he comes up is like, is a way for me to beat him. Um, and writers have done this throughout time, like Dante, put so many people in hell, that were his contemporaries. And I do wonder too, like what are in the writing that you do, what are some people who are targets that you reference directly and indirectly, right, in your work? And I was thinking about this, like recurring motifs, recurrent symbols, in this work.
I love that, and I love that there are like these moments to kind of critique and beat down, and then there are also in the poems all these kind of like icons, like heroes, or like I was thinking especially of music references in the poems, which are so delightful. I mean, we have everything from Chumbawamba to Katy Perry to Selena to MIA, all of it. And I
Yeah.
yesterday when we were having a smaller conversation with a small group of students, you were talking about how you often listen to music when you were writing, and you said, when you were writing the Queer Dactyls, you listened to Mexican ballads and disco and Duran Duran. And I wondered if you could tell us about one particular poem, if you remember a song you were listening to while you were writing it, and what that was for you.
Ooh. Yes, I love that. Um, mm. Jeez. Let's see. I know, I mean, the easiest answer, right, is the Queer Dactyl poem on page 27. That is Bitty Bitty Bomb Bomb,
Yes,
the
love
Selena song. I listened to that song so many times in the writing of that poem, and to the point that that Bitty Bitty Bomb Bomb became this kind of mantra
that.
that like I kept going back to, right, and thinking about that. There, unfortunately, there are some poems that did not make it to the manuscript that may someday appear in other manuscripts, but there is there's a poem. It's a what? Get this. It's a persona poem, and the persona is basically written from the perspective of Cuauhtemoc. Cuauhtemoc was the last Aztec ruler um, who was killed by Hernan Cortés. The thing about it is the poem is Cuauhtemoc as the Thin White Duke slash Ziggy Stardust. And what happens in that poem is Cuauhtemoc talks about the pain, right, of losing an empire, right, losing his people to the conquistadores. But the way that he grieves is like David Bowie slash like Iggy Pop. And I don't know if can you hear me well, by the way? Can you hear me well?
The sound is
Can you hear me fine now? Yeah. It's basically a poem that I wrote in Cuauhtemoc as the persona of Thin White Duke from David Bowie, and Cuauhtemoc as Ziggy Stardust from David Bowie. But for that poem, I listened to so much like David Bowie, Iggy Pop. I listened to a lot of what is his name from Velvet Underground? Um, if someone remembers the name of Velvet Underground's lead singer, um, yeah. So I was listening to a lot of that. I don't know if that answers the question.
my technology is melting, so I'm getting kind of. Christy, can you hear? Is there a
I can hear you. There's some weird, almost extraneous sound going on. I'm not sure what that is.
um,
Everybody appears to be muted except for the three of us.
well, we're actually 30, so maybe the are, are bidding. No, that was a past conversation. Thank you so much. Enjoyed this.
Thank you all so much, and thank you again, Nomi and everyone at University of Dallas. I hope you all are taking care of yourselves and each other. Wear those masks. Don't travel to places you shouldn't. And um, yeah, hopefully, I will see you all around in the World Wide Web. Thank you.
Yeah. Students
care.
are all